the One Piece story has actually revealed that at the very end of his pirating career, Roger was in fact completely broke. Another way to put this is that Gold Roger left nothing there. In their heyday, the Roger pirates in the One Piece story held enormous amounts of treasure. The story has very recently revealed that the crew took pretty much the biggest score we have ever seen in the series by stealing most of the Celestial Dragon's treasures from God Valley. Roger's crew, however, still sailed the seas for over a decade after this point, and in most flashback scenes we've seen of them, the Roger pirates were pretty much always on the hunt for more riches. The crew's immense wealth was also on display with things like their ship being made of the hugely expensive Adam wood, but also with something like Roger personally wielding a supreme great sword, one of the most rare and valuable items in the whole story. Why then does this video claim that Roger is actually a liar about his wealth, if the story itself shows that he was in fact in possession of all of these treasures? The truth is that by the time of his death, Goldie Roger had actually lost literally all of the treasures I had just listed. Despite Roger calling it his treasure, the One Piece was actually never Roger's treasure, but on top of this, Roger in fact left absolutely nothing of his own on the final island. This is something the One Piece manga revealed around 5 years ago. The One Piece treasure was actually something left behind on Laugh Tale 800 years ago by the mysterious figure known as Joy Boy, and his treasure was simply later found by Roger. What Roger was actually doing in his final moments was making the entire world go look for Joy Boy's treasure, not Roger's treasure. The story at this point has heavily hinted at this being because Roger wanted to start the Great Pirate Era in his final moments. To get as many people as possible to go look for the One Piece, Roger completely embellished all the details of his legend, using his reputation as the most infamous pirate in history to make the world chase after the final island. But it was all lies. But this also includes the fact that the Pirate King could not have left any of his own wealth behind on Laugh Tale, as Roger had already lost all of his money when he sailed there. Exactly 1 year before he completed his journey, Roger recruited Kosuke Oden to his pirate crew from the Whitebeard pirates, in exchange for Whitebeard lending him a man who could read the ancient language, which Roger needed to complete his journey. Roger gave literally all of his wealth to Whitebeard. I'm not making this up. Roger was actually even more crazy, where he didn't just leave all of his treasures to Whitebeard, but literally all of his cargo. Roger actually pissed Whitebeard off by doing this, since this meant that Roger had thoughtlessly also given him all of his food, which Whitebeard commanded to be returned to him, so that Oden and his family wouldn't starve. Let's however let this sink in. This was all of the plunder the Roger pirates had gathered in their decades of pirating, likely including everything they stole from God Valley. In this single scene, Roger pretty much both made Whitebeard the richest pirate in the world, while also leaving himself penniless. What this means is that even if Roger had wanted to, he had basically no wealth of his own to leave behind on the final island. But we actually know that Roger was even more cheap than this. A lot of One Piece fans for years speculated that Roger's other valuables, like his ship, sword, or even his hat, would be found on Laugh Tale, yet the Oden flashback also confirmed this to not be the case. In the scene after Roger and his crew return from the final island, we see that all of Roger's famous items were still with him. This even included the mysterious egg that the Roger pirates had seemingly been carrying on their ship for decades. So, it turns out that Roger simply left the One Piece treasure exactly as he had found it, and that he during his execution simply took credit from Joy Boy as the treasure's owner. It makes perfect sense, as the world government had done such a thorough job wiping Joy Boy's existence from history that barely anyone alive had ever heard of him. Yet, Roger himself was described as being the exact opposite of Joy Boy. Roger, in the eyes of the One Piece world, is basically the most famous person who has ever lived, where it's been said that there isn't a single soul in the world who hasn't heard his name. Naturally, as Roger wanted his final words to reach as many people as possible, he used his own reputation instead of Joy Boy's. There is actually a really interesting detail here, which is that the world government actually helped Roger immensely by removing the D from his name, turning him from Goldie Roger to Gold Roger. I don't know about you, but if the Pirate King literally bears the name Gold Roger, it is very easy to believe why people immediately started to think that he must also be the richest person in the world. I think this is also likely what happened in the actual story. Roger became known as both Gold Roger and the Pirate King right after he had found the final island, a full year before his execution. But the rumors about his treasure called the One Piece were completely made up by the public after they had heard of Roger's reputation. I would also imagine that a certain bird had a pretty big hand in spreading these stories. So, it turns out that the world government really did the old adage of one facing their destiny on the road to avoid it, where the decision to rename Roger likely completely backfired on them and directly led to the start of the Great Pirate Era. But I have a question. What actually happened to Roger's real treasure? Not the One Piece itself, but all the other valuables Roger himself had collected in his years as a pirate. I think this is something the story has actually given an answer for. In the post-time skip, we hear that there is an in-story rumor of Whitebeard himself having left a huge treasure behind after his own death. This treasure would naturally include all of the riches that Whitebeard himself got from Roger. Whitebeard's famous treasure is actually the reason why Stussy in the current story is hunting down the former Whitebeard pirates, where he is essentially just after Whitebeard's money. So, would this mean that while not the One Piece, there is this other enormous treasure out there in the world that is both the combined wealth of Roger and Whitebeard? The answer is actually no. By the way, before I reveal why, because you watched this video this far, definitely subscribe to the channel, where the entire channel is really nothing but more One Piece content just like this. The reason why Whitebeard left behind no treasure of his own is that Marco has revealed that what Whitebeard always did with his share of the loot was that he invested it all back in his home island. What Marco says is that Whitebeard after his death didn't actually leave any money behind, where all of it was used to transform his homeland from a war-torn wreck into a happy and functioning country that didn't have to join the world government. This is even a running joke with Whitebeard's character, where with both the Rocks Pirates and the Whitebeard Pirates, Whitebeard was always drinking in everyone else's tab, because he never had any spare money to use. Even with this lore, however, Whitebeard still didn't crack the top 30 in the global One Piece popularity poll. I guess you can't blame people for having taste. One really interesting detail about the wealth Roger gave Whitebeard is that the Roger Pirates apparently found devil fruits among the treasure they years ago stole from God Valley. From what we've seen though, the Roger Pirates apparently didn't eat these fruits themselves. This is just my idea. But these God Valley fruits could have eventually found their way to Whitebeard in the moment when Roger gave all of his treasure to him. This could possibly explain how some of the Whitebeard pirates have these top-end devil fruit powers, such as the diamond fruit, where these may have once been luxury items held by the celestial dragons. Yet, what about Roger's own personal valuables that we know he didn't leave with Whitebeard, such as his sword or his ship? The manga does actually give a few clues as to what may have happened to these items as well. We know Roger didn't leave them on Laugh-Tale, but in the scene where the Roger pirates disband, Roger is actually seen giving his hat to Rayleigh. It is also said that the only thing Roger took with him when leaving the crew was a bounce of medicine. What this means is that all of Roger's real valuables were left with his crew. So, who got what? I talked about this in one of my other videos, but out of all of Roger's crewmates, I think it would make a lot of sense if the Oro Jackson was left with Skopper Gaban. Gaban was not only Roger's left hand, but he was the crew's navigator, meaning that he may well have had one of the closest bonds with the ship. What we also know is that Gaban, even in retirement, loves to travel. This was something personally confirmed by Oda, but we have even seen Gaban in the canon story, having gone all the way to Reverse Mountain just to visit Crocus at the start of the post-time skip. Gaban's adventures clearly didn't stop at his retirement, where he even got a huge scar on his face at some point after the crew disbanded. It's by no means confirmed, but I personally like the idea that Roger just left his ship with his navigator, and that Gaban has been using it to basically go around the world in his retirement. Granted, I'm not sure what crew Gaban could have used to man the ship. Maybe he actually did a lot of family vacations, with just Cologne and Ripley as his crew. That could be really cute. As for Ace, Roger's supreme great sword, I genuinely have no idea which crewmate Roger could have left it to. Rayleigh, Oden and Shanks were all swordsmen, yet they are all seen using different swords after the Roger pirates disbanded. It is actually not unlikely that nobody got Ace, as the One Piece world seemingly has a custom of graded swords being left with their users. This for example happened with Ryuma, where Susui was buried with him for hundreds of years. We also know that Whitebeard's supreme great blade was left at his grave. Still, the Roger pirates could not actually do this same thing, as Roger's body was seemingly left in the hands of the world government. I suppose Roger could have still gotten his own memorial, even without his corpse, and this is where the crew could have left Ace. We for example saw that the minks and the samurai honored Pedro in this way, even though his real remains were left behind on Whole Cake Island. By the way, the idea of the world government still being in possession of Roger's remains is actually a terrifying thought, because if they actually managed to do something like keep his blood in store all these years, this would leave the door open for us seeing a Seraphim version of Roger at some point in the final saga. There is another interesting overlooked detail in the manga about Roger's character and his valued items, which is that Roger actually wore many hats. After giving Shanks the straw hat, Roger still had 2 other hats of his own. While he gave the other to Rayleigh, we actually see Roger wearing the second hat after the crew's disbandment, when he was having his last talk with Whitebeard. Roger, being a guy who likes hats, is such a cool detail, since this is apparently a habit Shanks adopted from him, where Shanks' vibra card says that Shanks loves hats. I think this also really shows how much Shanks values his promise to Luffy by him not wearing any hat in the years after meeting Luffy. I guess this also touches upon what ultimately was Roger's greatest treasure, which very likely was the straw hat itself, as it is also basically Shanks and Luffy's greatest treasure. Unlike all of Roger's other treasures though, this was something Roger gave up long before his death, where we've seen that Shanks was already wearing the straw hat when he was just a kid. It is kind of sad that Roger with his own eyes never got to see what should have actually been his greatest treasure, which was Ace, the sun, not the sword. So, with all of this covered, what actually is the conclusion about Goldie Roger's treasure? I think the answer is that if Roger had actually been honest during his execution, he would have said something like this. My treasure? Well, I gave all my money to Whitebeard, but he's probably already spent it at this point. My other stuff is now with my crewmates. My wife is about to give birth in the South Blue, but that's neither here or there. I've still got some medicine, but oh yeah, I guess the Marines already took that from me when I turned myself in. I almost forgot. There's this guy you've never heard of, called Joy Boy. Go look for his treasure on the final island, or else the government is going to sink the world. I think Roger here is actually making a good case why sometimes you just have to use clickbait. I also think Roger should have added that there was this other pirate called Rox Diesebek who was even stronger than him, but since Roger didn't mention this, you will just have to click here to watch this video, which is a full breakdown of why despite all his legendary strength, Roger never in his life surpassed the monster that was Rox in his final demon form. Huge thanks to all my members for their own bountiful treasure that they've allowed me to plunder. I really appreciate everyone who watched all the way to the end.